Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lee Schwartz, and I'd like to welcome you to the fourth and final webinar in our 2023 dental series titled Ensuring a Healthy Future, Strategies for Seamless Owner Recruitment and Retirement. We're happy we were able to bring you another slate of great topics this year. And keep in mind, if you have other topics that would be of interest for future webinars, please reach out, let us know. We'd love to include them. Now, before we get started, I just want to take a sec and say a few words about SVA and our history in the dental industry. Like many of you, we got to where we are by being independent, and our vision moving forward is to remain that way and continue serving the same clients we have since 1974. And a huge part of that client base over these last now almost 50 years has been dental practices. Our mindset is that when you're a practice owner or shareholder, you have to work with someone who's more than just an accountant or a tax preparer. You need someone who's a true advisor working collaboratively with you. This webinar and others like it are just one small way in which we do that. As far as this webinar goes, please send in any questions you may have as we go, but we're going to wait till the end to actually answer them. If you're a client and your question doesn't get answered, we'd encourage you to reach out to your SVA contact. If you're not a client and you have questions, please reach out to me or John Armstrong in our business development group, and we'll make sure one of our subject matter experts gets your questions answered. Now, we've got two of the most experienced people in our healthcare and dental practice to walk you through everything today. First off, we have Matt Vanderloo, who's not only a principal in our healthcare group, but is also SVA's CEO. And we have Nate Drykosen, a senior manager in our healthcare group who works with practice owners and practice managers on efficiency, profitability, and of course, tax strategies. All right, so let's get started. Let's dive in. Matt, I'll kick it off to you.
Thanks, Lee. Excited to have everybody here today. Excited to get to steal a few minutes out of everyone's day today to talk a little bit about transitions and how we can plan for those and make those more effective and more successful long term. We do have a couple important things we're going to try and hit on today. We're going to talk about the importance of being strategic as we think about these transitions and planning ahead. We're going to help identify some effective methods for not only identifying people that might work in a transition here and might be good candidates, but also how we attract those potential owners to a practice. And then we'll talk about strategies about how we seamlessly add new owners and how we make that transition as smooth as possible when there's an owner retirement or a change in ownership going on. As we talk today, I think some of these slides and some of our language, we might talk a little bit more about this from a buyer perspective and how does a buyer look to, or I'm sorry, from a seller perspective, and how do, as a seller, do we look to find a buyer and bring somebody new into the practice? But really, all of the ideas we're going to talk about today work from either perspective, and we can do from either way. So we might use language that talks more about the seller of a practice, but the same thing's going to apply from the buyer's perspective. And really, we're trying to focus today on how do we make this transition and transaction as smooth as possible for both sides, from both the buyers and the seller's perspective. So with that, let's jump right in. And really, as we think about practice ownership transactions, transitions here, want to think about it from both the perspective of a single owner in a practice maybe has only one dentist working in it, sole owner, and what's it going to look like when that transition happens. And we'll talk a little bit too from a group practice and what that looks like. In that single owner practice, as we think about this, there's, I think, really kind of two models we can think of. One is today's owner is the owner today, sells the practice, and tomorrow we have a new owner. And there's a real hard cutoff and a real quick cutoff from old owner to new owner. The other model we might think about there too is instead of immediately going into ownership, it might be a new associate who comes into that practice. So we've got our one single current owner right now, the only dentist in the practice. They bring in a new associate to work in the practice. That new associate works there for a while, and then there's a transition into ownership for that associate. And either now we have two owners and we've turning into a small new group practice, or the old owner then transitions out either when the new associate becomes an owner or after some agreed upon period of time. In a group practice, as we think about a group, typically the model there is that we've got a group of owners, a new associate comes in, and works in the practice, and at some point they become an owner. They might not, they might stay at the associate level for their career with that group practice. And then separate from that, often at some point in the future, one of our owners retires. And over time, we've got new associates coming into the ownership group, moving from associate to ownership. And separate from that, we've got owners retiring. At a high level, we're going to, in a minute here, just look at some goals of transitions. At a high level, those goals are going to be the same in both types of transitions, whether it's single owner practice, group practices. And it's the details that are going to start to look really different. For those single owner practices, these transitions can be really more of an event. They're larger, more impactful in a practice, discrete events that are happening over time. In a group practice, really our ultimate goal is to not make these big events and to make them a normal part of operations. What standards, what practices, what standard operating procedures can we set up in a group practice so that it's really easy and there's very little disruption to anyone when we have a new owner or when we have an owner leave as an owner. There's got to be some changes into who sees the patients, but other than that, in general, it can be very seamless, very non-disruptive in a group practice. And that transition, I advanced too quickly. If we can flip back, I'm going to flip back one slide here. Oh, there we go. Overall, I think we've identified 4 goals that are going to matter no matter what type of transition it is, centered around really 2 things, patients and staff. No matter what we're doing this transaction, we want to make sure we're doing everything we can to maintain the patient base, to not impact quality of care for the patients, and to create stability for the staff. And these are important to both the buyer and the seller. The seller wants to maximize value on a transaction like this, and the best way they can do that is make sure all the patients stayed in the practice, make sure the patients are all cared for well, and make sure all the staff stay there. Because any change there is going to have some disruption in value, probably negatively for the seller. And as a buyer, that value you're buying hinges upon the patients in the practice. So we want to make sure as a buyer that all those patients are sticky and stay with the practice, that the staff is there. I think everybody's seeing in their practices, if you're having to hire, it's incredibly difficult. So if staff leave in a transition, it's going to be very difficult and it's going to have an impact on value. And then ultimately too, there's an exchange of value for that ownership interest. And as sellers wanting to maximize their value, buyer wanting to make sure they're paying a fair value for what they're acquiring. So to maintain those goals, we need to think about these transitions strategically. So how do we put a strategy together to make sure the transition is as effective as possible, that we're identifying the right people to look at, which requires some planning and some thinking ahead here. It's important to be strategic about this because thinking about this, strategically planning this, sets the stage for the transition and the transaction to be successful, and for it to long-term be successful for both the seller and for the buyer. A strategic plan here is going to make sure that we're achieving those overall goals. We're maintaining the patient base. We're maintaining the quality of care for patients. We're creating stability for the staff so that they're staying with the practice. And then there's that exchange of value. As a seller, being strategic about this, having a plan is going to maximize your value in the transaction, which is important for the seller. As a buyer, if we're strategic, we're setting this up for success. The transition, it's also going to set the buyer up for the most success on the back end. They're going to make sure that they've got the patients there, they have the staff there, that there's a good transition to make sure where everyone stays, and that this is successful for the buyer. And then importantly, and one that I don't think gets enough attention and we think about enough, doing this well, being strategic and thoughtful about it really sets the stage for the relationship between the buyer and the seller after this transition. In a single owner practice or even in a group practice, usually that seller, they've had this practice, they've built it up, they've been there a long time, they've got a connection to the staff, to the patients, and walking away and never having any contact with that practice again usually isn't a successful outcome for them. So they're probably going to want some contact with the buyer and with that practice after they leave. And as a buyer, we want to set the stage now for what that's going to look like, how involved they're going to be, when we might see them. Is it just at a Christmas party once a year, or do they have more interaction with the staff and with the practice? So we can really set that up as a part of the transition. There are lots of different ways as a seller to think about identifying and attracting potential owners to the practice. What the big key is going to be to leverage your network to help do this. And that network is wide, and there's a lot of different channels to think about and utilize there. You want to talk to your colleagues in your marketplace. You want to talk to your dental school classmates. Talk to any contacts you might have at dental schools, the recruiters there, the placement officers there. You want to talk to your vendor network. The WDA and ADA also have different tools and different ways you might be able to link into potential owners and identify those and get those people interested in your practice. So all sorts of different ways and different things you can do and utilize your network to do. The other piece you have in there is that there are professionals out there who can help you identify new potential owners and buyers, associates in your practice. And that might be the right way to go too, depending on how successful you are, how much time you want to devote to this, and how much effort you want to put into the process. Group practices, I think, are at a little advantage here over the single owner practice, and that in a group practice, especially a larger group practice, there might be a dedicated HR person there who can make this a part of their regular ongoing activities to be constantly looking for new professionals. And group practices, because of that, are also going through this more often. So they can have a better defined process and procedures in place for this. If you're a single owner, this might be a once in a lifetime opportunity or activity. So you're doing it once and then you're done. So you don't have that same experience to rely upon. So that as a single owner, it might be even more important to have some professionals involved to help you through that process and to help you be successful. There are some keys to identifying and attracting that talent to your practice and making this a good relationship at the start. And I think all these keys are important for both the buyer's perspective and the seller's perspective. We want to make sure we're having candid discussions from both sides. Both sides are being open and honest about what they want and what they see in this. If anybody's holding back and not being completely honest up front, we can set ourselves up to be in a tricky position down the path here. We want to have talks about career goals. When do people want to be an owner? How long are they willing to work as an associate? If you're selling to someone else, how long do you hope to stay on in the practice after that sale before you fully retire? What do those timeframes look like? What are our expectations? You know, how much of the current patient base is being transitioned to the new owner? How are we going to handle new patients that come to the practice? And then up front, even before we're talking about the specifics of the sale, before somebody's joined the practice, it's good to have some general discussions about what the structure of a sale might look like and what that potential price might look like. In terms of structure, we can have some discussions now about how much the seller might be willing to finance versus how much they're looking for in cash up front. What that overlap might look like with two people in the practice, whether it's a stock sale, an asset sale, or some sort of a mix there. On price, it doesn't have to be necessarily a specific dollar. It might be a range, or even more importantly, it might be more of a discussion of the methodology. How are we going to determine what that price is? Are we going to bring in somebody from the outside to do evaluation, or two people or three people and average those? But having some general agreement on what that might look like is going to make for a cleaner and more successful transition. Nate, what other thoughts do you have on how we can make this a successful transition for folks?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. You know, I think we can take a little bit of a deeper dive, still keep this at a higher level, but look at some specific strategies for adding new owners and continuing business as usual. So first step is be ready to share information with them. And sometimes that takes a little bit of preparation. As much as we try, sometimes the financial information might need a little bit of cleaning up. Sometimes just simply gathering all of that information is what's needed. And of course, you know, somebody's prospectively looking at buying a business, they might have some questions or want some deeper insights. So it's best to get started on that sooner than later. Make sure you're planning introductions. You know, again, you're looking to achieve continuity here, both on the personnel side, patient side, and then also with existing relationships with vendors, bankers, or any other folks within the business's professional network. Sometimes, you know, from a personal aspect, change can be hard, and communicating this news to your staff is going to be crucial to help with a smooth transition. Also, pull together your trusted advisors. You know, on the slide, we mentioned attorneys, your CPA, your banker. It's going to be a combined effort to have this thing come together and come together well. So you definitely want to get everybody at your table to start the discussion. One person that is not on here that you might consider, again, depending upon how you want to determine a value for your practice, you might consider pulling in a certified appraiser to help determine a value as well. Additionally, you want to get your associates involved in management activities when the time is right. This is going to help them build a business management perspective, help ease the transition as they take on and step into more and more of that role. Have a timeline and stick to it. Generally speaking, a comfortable but realistic timeline is what's best. And in practice, often we see that over multiple years. Think about what are your expectations for your associate and communicate those to them. It's hard to achieve or maintain a standard that you expect if that's not communicated. And that goes beyond just their effort in the clinic as well. What are your expectations of them in terms of roles and responsibilities as a budding business? Because of course, that's not something that's taught in dental school. Additionally, think about if you're going from either a single owner to a multiple owner model or multiple owner to, again, a multiple owner model. Think about your compensation formula. What's the most fair way to help split your profits and also compensate each other fairly? And thinking about, well, could some of this buy-in be done through that compensation formula? And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So really, at a high level, there's a couple general ways to structure a transition like this. The first being an asset sale, and the second being a stock sale. These sometimes we do see hybrids of the two models, but if you were to put them each in a silo, this is how they're most easily categorized. Generally speaking, asset sales tend to be a better deal for the buyer. Stock sales generally tend to be a little bit better deal for the seller. But really, we want to think about what exactly is being transacted with this transition. So really, what are you buying or selling? The first piece is going to be your tangible assets, your accounts receivable, inventory and supplies, equipment. Is the building going to be part of this discussion as well? Or is that an asset if you own the building, is that an asset you'd like to retain and then rent to the clinic going forward? Certainly, adding a building to the transaction certainly adds a lot of value and brings with it its own considerations as well. Beyond the tangible assets, you've got some intangible items as well. Generally, we tend to call this in the industry goodwill, but often what this means is capturing the practice reputation that you've built, your developed client base, and developed service offerings, especially if they're either niche or maybe a little bit different than what tends to be offered by your competitors or your peers. There's inherent value in all of those items. Moving on to the terms of the deal, some prevailing models would be cash at closing, seller financing, practice financing, profit redistribution. With cash at closing, oftentimes that requires the buyer to receive financing from a lending institution. Generally, that results in complete cash up front to the seller. So the seller's receiving their lump sum of the transaction. And over time, generally that amounts to a larger overall total cost for the buyer. With seller financing, buyers paying it off over time, generally with an interest rate component that generally stays with the seller. So a little bit of a return on investment there. Practice financing can generally be paying off over the time to the practice, where the practice itself buys back the seller's interest and then sells it to the buyer. So similar to the seller financing, but not quite the same. And kind of the fourth model on here being a profit redistribution, taking however that compensation breaks out and whatever's fair and redistributing that between the doctors to achieve slowly buying in over time. Now, that model typically tends to generally be a pre-tax model and ends up being cheapest for the buyer, but it can be a little bit complicated depending on your desired outcomes. For example, in a multiple owner situation, you'll want to consider how the possibility of additional shareholders continuing to exit without their portions being completely closed should be addressed. So thinking about transitioning to retirement, you want to make sure that you're ready for retirement as a seller, both mentally and financially. You know, a lot of times financially tends to be the focus, but equally significant is the mind shift that's required of no longer working. You're going to want to stick to the established timeline, whatever that is, because not much is more effective at souring a relationship than continuing to string this out longer than it needs to be for whatever reason. It's just going to frustrate your associate eventual owner, and possibly all the other connections, the staff, vendors, everyone associated with the transition. Make sure that you're completing your agreed upon activities, and that kind of ties in with sticking to your timeline, making sure you're transitioning management responsibilities, notifying patients appropriately, and also minding your legal contracts and making sure logistically everything is planned to switch over to new ownership. Think about your post-retirement involvement. Now, likely to this point, you've developed a little bit of a mentor relationship with your associate. Do you expect that that relationship will continue? If not, you're going to want to define what that relationship should look like going into the future. And then beyond that, make sure that you're clear about your desired availability to continue to be involved in the practice to whatever extent you'd like to be, if at all. And of course, make sure logistically all sorts of things are transitioned to ownership so that if practice doesn't continue, need to reach out to you for little tidbits trickling on into the future. So a couple different considerations depending upon how the eventual structure will be from single owner to single owner. Generally, that transition happens pretty quickly. And for many, that sometimes results in going literally from a full schedule one day to essentially no schedule the next. And that can be tough. That's definitely a change of pace and something to consider. From a single owner to multiple owners, a lot of times this comes up faster than expected. You're going to want to set your practice up now based on your desired outcomes for the transaction, kind of work backwards to figure out the logistics, the details of how that's going to be structured. For example, maybe you have an end date in mind. Start thinking about what you need to accomplish, what items you need to get organized right now to help make that happen and start working backwards for a timeline for the transition. And lastly, with the group practice, it's going to be a very dynamic situation. So oftentimes, if you have multiple owners, you can have a lot of differing opinions. So generally, you're going to want to have an open discussion and probably several discussions. Incorporate those expectations that everyone agrees upon into a shareholder or partnership agreement to give clarity and create a standard foundation, especially if one has not been in place to this point. Having a buy-sell agreement in place helps lay that groundwork for both now and into the future for future transactions, and often gives the buyers a sense of being treated fairly. So with that, we've covered a lot of material today at a very high level, and the transition is often very time-consuming and emotional process. Not to mention, as Matt mentioned earlier, for many practice owners, this might be the single biggest transaction of their lives. So if you work with SVA currently, certainly reach out to your advisor for help in guiding you through this process or to start these discussions. And also, if you're not currently with SVA, still equally important to pull all your advisors into the discussion and get their feedback and thoughts as you work through this process. So Lee, throw it back to you. Are there any questions that came in that aren't situation specific or practice specific that we can talk through?
We do. We have several, and we'll jump in. But Nate, you're right. Thanks for mentioning that. Super important. You guys covered a ton of information in 24 minutes, but it's there's a lot here. So let's jump right in and go with our first question here. You guys touched on this a little bit, but the question is there anything that a single owner should think about doing before starting to identify an associate?
Yeah, great question. I think there's all sorts of things that single owner could think about to make sure they're prepared for a lot of those candid discussions that are going to happen. Nate had mentioned, there's going to be a big exchange of information. So as this potential seller, before you start talking to potential buyers, you want to get all that information in order. make sure you've got it all ready to go. If there's any, kind of cleanup that needs to be done to it, make sure that's done. If you're unsure of what you might be thinking about for a price on your practice, there's work that you could be doing there prior to talking to a potential buyer too. So you've got a sense of what you might want to ask, how you might want to think about that.
Okay, great. Another question that came in is, and this is a little bit, I guess, outside of the scope of an internal transition, but do DSOs prefer to buy one practice, or do they give more money per practice if there's more than one location?
Ooh, that's a great question too. So I think what we're asking, what the question there is getting at, will DSOs put a higher value on a practice with multiple locations or a practice with one location? And I would say that really depends, and we need to get more into the specifics there. I think in general, what we see is that DSOs will pay a higher price, a higher multiple for larger practices and practices that have more patients, because generally DSOs are working on a model that involves volume and delivering care at a cheaper cost than I think other practices can. So it might be that we'd have to look at the practice. There might be practices that somehow, for whatever reason, are serving more patients out of one location than another practice would serve out of multiple locations. So that would impact it. I think it would also be impacted on whether or not the DSO already has a presence in a marketplace. For a DSO moving into Madison might be more interested in buying a practice that has multiple Madison locations than a DSO that's already in Madison that might be buying multiple locations that are already right next door to a bunch of offices it already has. Because the DSO isn't going to want to acquire a bunch of leases right next door to each other that they've got to pay rent expense on way into the future. So the other piece that would be important there is, if we've got multiple locations, what is the situation like at each of those locations? Are there already in place long-term leases that the DSO would have to assume? Or are there shorter leases that the DSO might be able to get out of? So that's the really long answer to, it's really going to be very situationally specific as to what the DSO is going to look at. And it's going to depend very much on the DSO you're talking to and whether or not they're already in the marketplace here.
Great, thank you. So you guys talked a little bit about the single owner transition or practice with several owners and how different that looks. This question, I guess, is trying to maybe have it both ways. So have you seen anyone successfully transition a single owner practice by bringing on an associate and working alongside that person for a period of time? Sounds like somebody's not as super comfortable with that full schedule one day and no schedule the next.
Yes, that I can feel that one, Matt. That can work. The struggle there is making sure that you have the volume to support the schedules for as busy as you want to be, and also to be fair to the associate that's coming on board, to making sure that they can still accomplish their goals in terms of production, which obviously translates to their compensation as well. So provided that you have the volumes to support that, and obviously compatibly, in terms of a relationship together and working together, having a good working relationship, yes, that can work.
Great. Okay, good. We've had a couple others come in, but we can reach out to you directly. I guess we're at time, so I want to wrap up and just let everybody know that you can go to svaaccountants.com to sign up for news and information that may affect your practice. So this was the last webinar in our 2023 series. So we hope you've enjoyed them. Just know the health of independent dental practices in and around Wisconsin, super important to us. So we're happy to continue providing this type of valuable information, but keep in mind, if there are topics that you'd find valuable for our future dental webinars, please reach out, let us know. We'd love to include those topics as well. I just want to remind everybody that the SVA team is only a phone call or an email away. So if you're a client, reach out to your SVA professional as questions arise. And if you're not currently an SVA client, please become one. Or if you have questions, you can contact me or John Armstrong, and we can get you answers to those questions. Thanks again, guys. A ton of great information, not just in this webinar, but in all of the ones you guys have done. So great work. And I just want to thank everybody for attending today. And we wish you a very wonderful holiday season. Bye-bye.